And we're going to get started here. So, I want to answer one or two questions. One is, who am I? Well, I'm just a guy who thought he was going insane and said, what can I do? And I saw Nacy on Bill Maher, and I said, wow, she's at Duke. There's a possibility that I could get her to come to Pittsburgh, and that's why we're here tonight. And then she is here and ready to go. But, as I said earlier, I'm a believer in building up. I'm a believer in coming together. I still think we can come together, make things happen, and build our community and country. Yes? I think that begins by recognizing each other by name and by soul. So, if you don't mind, and you don't have to, take just 30 seconds and just go over and say hello to somebody you don't know. Okay, you can make golf and theater plans later. Yes, not only was I the organizer of Guardians of Angels Humane Society, I'm also a pastor. So I wonder if we would take a breath, and I would like to ask you to join me in a moment of reflection for our Jewish brothers and sisters and all of the folks who have suffered this last year in our country as a result of mass shooting. Let's take a moment. And as an animal guy, I'm a fan of St. Francis, who wrote, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Help us to console others instead of being consoled, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it's in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and together we come together to be together as a community and as a country. Thank you for indulging me on that. So, I thought I was going to go nuts, and I saw Professor Nacy MacLean on Bill Maher, who I think is really funny, and watch every week. And so, knowing that she was at Duke, I took a chance and I sent an email. She quickly responded back. We had a little conversation, and she's here tonight. Professor Nacy MacLean is the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, and the award-winning author of several books, including Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace, The American Women's Movement, 1945 to 2000, A Brief Movement, 1945 to the present, about debating the American conservative movement. She is also the author of the talk tonight, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. It is getting a lot of laud and praise. Booklist called it perhaps the best explanation to date of the roots of the political divide that threatens the American system today. She is also a winner of the National Book Award and Leyland Foundation Cultural Freedom Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Award in Current Affairs, and the Lillian Smith Book Award. The Nation magazine named Democracy in Chains the most valuable book in America. Let's give it up for Professor MacLean.
Thank you so much, Terry, and good evening, everyone. I might need that handheld mic after all, Terry. After all that painstaking... oh, wait, there we go. Let's put it on the chair in case... How are you all? Good. So, it's so good to be with you here. My husband and I used to come over here to Jordan Lake with our dog on Saturdays and Sundays. I never tried to do it on a weekday. It's a little harder, especially at this time. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to thank Terry Dorsey for organizing this and having the vision, and Greg for hosting us, and you all for coming out this tonight and taking a night out to talk about these issues. It has been a pretty fraught week, so let me start with two questions. How many of you feel like our political system is working now in the way you were taught it was supposed to work in civics classes? Anybody? Okay. How many people are concerned about the direction our country is heading? Good. Okay. I know why you're here. And you know that American politics are in crisis today. I don't think I need to tell you that, both in Washington and in states like our own North Carolina. Something is happening that goes beyond the right-wing politics we'd grown accustomed to, say, since the 1980s, right? There's a sense that something has accelerated and turned, and it's what we're facing is very different. But what you're probably trying to figure out is not whether we've reached a crisis point, but how and why, and what that means for how we might get out of here. And I hope my remarks tonight will provide some illumination, and I hope that our discussion afterwards will provide still more. The book that I'm here to talk to you about, Democracy in Chains, provides a backstory to the situation we face, a backstory that is still little known. It's the story of two men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converged beginning in the 1970s through a shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country had built up over the course of the 20th century. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his academic career in Virginia universities, and the CEO is, of course, the Kansas-based Charles Koch, who spent most of his adult life, when he wasn't building Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, spent most of his adult life trying to find a way to make our country, and the wider world, in fact, conform to his arch vision of economic liberty. But it was Buchanan, I learned, who taught Charles Koch that for economic liberty to prevail, democracy must be enchained. Hence my title. The story the book tells is first of all of the crucible in which Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty, and that was as the civil rights movement was sweeping his adopted state of Virginia, his own campus at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and the nation as a whole in the late 1950s and 1960s. The story then shifts to how Charles Koch began funding an apparatus, an infrastructure, to make that idea a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the situation we are now facing. I have to admit, it's a frightening story, but I also think knowing that what we're up against is vital to assessing how best to defend a democracy that I think many of us can now see is facing existential threat. A public health nurse who read the book and wrote to me gave what I felt was an apt analogy when she said, I realized you have to get the diagnosis right before you can determine the best treatment plan. And I think that's a helpful way to think about this. But rather than say more about the conclusions that I've reached, what I want to do is tell you the story of how I stumbled on the trail that led me to these conclusions, because I think that will give you a sharper sense of the stakes of all of this. And then I may read a selection or two before taking your questions. Does that sound okay? Good. Okay. So I started the research that became this book in 2006. At that point, I had never heard of James McGill Buchanan, so don't feel bad if you haven't. I also hadn't heard of Charles Koch, because his name was not yet a household name for those outside the fossil fuel industry and the libertarian movement. I am a historian of social movements in the United States and their impact on public policy, with a particular interest in the U.S. South. And I happened to go into the archives of the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker relief group that has its archives in Philadelphia, in 2006. And there I found documentation of a story that I didn't know, but that moved me deeply. It was the story of the school closures in Prince Edward County, Virginia, from 1959 to 1964. What happened was the county leaders, the white county leaders, decided to punish the black children of that county, the high school students in particular, for having gone on a 100% solid student strike in 1959 for a decent high school, a high school as good as the high school the white kids attended, and then folded their case into the challenges the NAACP was waging that became the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So Prince Edward was one of those cases. And in 1959, when county leaders were finally pushed to stop dragging their feet and desegregate their public school system, they said, nope, we're going, this is their language, going out of the public school business entirely. They completely shut down the public school system in Prince Edward, this county in the old plantation belt of Virginia, and they sent the white kids off to a private segregation academy beyond the reach of the courts, while leaving black children, kids who were about to begin first grade to kids who were supposed to be graduating high school that year, with no formal education whatsoever for 5 years. Only what social movement organizations were able to provide. So I was shocked by this story that I'd never encountered before. I was deeply moved, and I started to research. And I fairly quickly found that tax-funded school vouchers were a crucial piece of this story, and in fact were the centerpiece of the massive resistance legislation adopted by much of the segregationist South to fight Brown versus Board of Education. Then I learned in short order that the Chicago free market economist, Milton Friedman, many of you probably have encountered his book, Capitalism and Freedom, or his many commentaries over the years. He wrote his first manifesto for such vouchers in 1955, the year after the Brown decision, in the full knowledge of how it would be used by Southern state officials anxious to fight Brown. So that was intriguing, and a story that was not a story we knew, and I thought we did need to know, so I began digging in there. But in following a footnote, I learned of a 1959 report by two other economists who had set up a center at the University of Virginia in 1956, and one of them was this James McGill Buchanan, the new chair of the economics department, hired in 1956 at the peak of this massive resistance. And this report that they issued essentially called for privatizing the schools in the state before that verb privatize had entered our national vocabulary. As I mentioned, this was the key element of the massive resistance legislation. The only thing that would enable massive resistance to continue was those vouchers. So this intrigued me to see two university professors making the case for what the state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it also intrigued me that they did this not in racist terms, but in economic terms, self-consciously leveraging the authority of their discipline and Buchanan's standing as the chair of the department in a school founded by Thomas Jefferson to make this case, basically arguing in the same terms that we often hear today about vouchers and charter schools and privatization, that it would end government monopoly, it would create more competition and choice, and so forth and so on. But it was clear that the only people who were going to use these vouchers at the time were white kids, because they were the only ones fleeing the public school systems, and black parents and communities rejected these vouchers to a person. So basically, I could see in this report that these two economists were exploiting the crisis and the reaction of many whites to the prospect of desegregation to move their libertarian economic agenda. And they actually said in the cover letter to state legislators that accompanied this report that they were issuing it, and I quote, letting the chips fall where they may. Letting the chips fall where they may. It was very obvious to me as a historian where those chips would fall, as it was to them when they wrote that letter. And I frankly wondered how anyone could do such a thing, right? Like not in a state of kind of active, irrational rage of the kind we often maybe associate with reaction in Mississippi or Alabama, but in self-conscious calculation by two very worldly scholars. Buchanan had just come back from a long stay in Italy on a fellowship, etc. They were taking this moment, exploiting it to move their agenda. So that put Buchanan and his colleague on my radar. And I began seeking more information and learned that Buchanan had gone on to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986, the first U.S. Southerner to do so. I learned that he had pioneered a new way of thinking called public choice economics, and that this school of thought became influential also in political science and law schools, and perhaps particularly among activists and elected officials on the political right. So what Buchanan did that was new and gained notice was apply Chicago-style economic assumptions to political actors to say we had understood politics in the wrong way, that we needed to think about actors in public life as self-interested actors, just the way Chicago understood actors in the marketplace, right? These were rational individual actors consciously seeking their own self-interest, and this is the key part where the other shoe drops, not the common good, as they claimed. So it was very much a debunking endeavor from the outset, and was actually supported by the main institution of free market fundamentalism at the time. This public choice economics led to a new attention to the incentives of the political process, and to how altering the incentives and the rules of that process could yield different outcomes. I want to be clear and say that these ideas have since interested some people who are not on the political right. They've found them useful to think with, and you know how you might tweak the incentives, say, of public life, say, to get better health outcomes and things like that. But I also learned, as I dug deeper, that Buchanan's version of this larger school of ideas, what he and his colleagues called the Virginia School of Political Economy, was always distinctive and deeply political. And Buchanan himself said, looking back in a documentary made in 2007, that when he set to work in the late 1950s, the idea of the common good was dominant, right? The idea of the public interest was dominant. The idea that when we get involved running for office, or say organizing a union or a civil rights group or an environmental group or the League of Women Voters, whatever it is we do, we're doing that because we're trying to advance the public interest in good faith as we understand it. He said, no, that's not it. He said, that's what I wanted to tear down, the hypocrisy of calling something in the public interest. This was a new school of thought to me. Why would anyone want to do that, I wondered. And I learned, as I read more, that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no such thing as the common good. It's a kind of a mask from their perspective. And in their view, any such notion of shared purpose will lead government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. Buchanan and his colleagues came to argue that democracy systematically violates the individual liberty of the minority. Now, this guy has 20 volumes of collected works and left a house full of papers. And the only minority I ever saw him showing sustained concern with was the minority of the wealthy, taxpayers, and corporations who don't share the majority's view of the public interest. And Buchanan and his fellows argued in very moralistic terms that government all but steals the property of such people by taxing them or regulating them for purposes that they don't share. So he was really at pains to argue that we are not our brother's keepers, or at least we should not be able to use government to shift tax revenues from one person to another, or to regulate private conduct. And since Terry is a minister, I sometimes vary what I share from the books, but I want to read you a little section that will make this clear about how radical his vision was. So this was in 1975, the same year that he attended the founding seminar, or 74 rather, of what became the Cato Institute. Buchanan published an article called The Samaritan's Dilemma, a piece that has been used by the right ever since to show, in effect, that the ethics of Jesus, as reported in the Gospel of Luke, produced perverse results in the modern world. Buchanan summarized this piece of what he termed prescriptive diagnosis this way. He said, "We may simply be too compassionate for our own well-being or for that of an orderly and productive free society. He went on, modern man has become incapable of making the choices that are required to prevent his exploitation by predators of his own species, whether the predation be conscious or unconscious. Predators of his own species? It was a perverse application of the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a kind resident of Samaria comes to the aid of a Jewish traveler who has been stripped, robbed, beaten, and left to die. A victim of cruelty, in other words, in the story Jesus used to show his followers that one should love his neighbor as himself and not draw those boundaries tightly. Even Jesus wanted to show when the neighbor was a member of a despised outgroup, as Jews were to Samaritans. But in the view of the libertarian economist, Jesus was mistaken. Conscripting the Good Samaritan story, Buchanan made his case that, and I quote, modern man has gone soft. He lacks the strategic courage needed to restore the market to its proper ordering. By this logic, what seemed to be the ethical thing to do to help someone in need was not, after all, the correct thing to do, because the assistance would encourage the recipient to, in Buchanan's word, exploit the giver rather than solve his own problems. Buchanan used as an analogy the spanking of children by parents. It might hurt, he said, but it taught, and I quote, the fear of punishment that will inhibit future misbehavior. Similarly, he said, the potential parasite needed disciplining to prevent efforts to deliberately exploit society's producers. More than any other piece, this article captured the stark morality of libertarianism, offering, as it were, the cause's prescription for how America's third century could reverse the soft errors of its second. And frankly, what we see on the border today comes out of decades of this kind of thinking, this kind of fear of a caravan, the incitement of fear of this caravan of desperate people. So, for those who think this way, I learned, justice is a pretty simple matter. And one of Buchanan's colleagues put it this way when he was here for Civitas, an organization I'm sure many of you know. He said, I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn. That's social justice. So only in this view, if there is unanimity, can a purpose truly be said to be fair or to be advancing the common good. But Buchanan himself didn't stop there with this kind of diagnosis. By the way, I want to make clear that this was all at the level of theory, not empirical research. That's important to keep in mind. But believing strongly that he was right, he moved from analysis into prescription, into trying to design a system that could protect that unwilling minority, as some of his colleagues put it, that could protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of this wealthy minority to a degree that no society anywhere had ever done. He was working on this in the second half of the 1970s. And in 1980, the military junta of Augusto Pinochet and his fellow officers in Chile invited Buchanan to Santiago to try out these ideas for how to devise a constitution that would protect capitalism from the people, from government. And the result of that is still in effect today. It's called the Constitution of Liberty. In 2013, Michelle Bachelet, a public official who herself had been a victim of torture, as had her doctor father, was elected by 2/3 of the Chilean people on a wide-ranging reform program because people were so frustrated with what had happened from the privatization of Social Security, education, and more. She won 2/3 of the vote. She got into office, and she realized she couldn't deliver on her promises to the people because of that constitution. She complained of its authoritarian trammels, in her phrase, and she said that Chile needs a constitution without locks and bolts. Not checks and balances, mind you, but locks and bolts. But Buchanan had been brought in precisely to craft those locks and bolts, and he did it well. Sadly, I have to tell you, too, this story is not a digression from our situation today. It is rather like the phrase on the National Archives, the past as prologue. That kind of a constitution of locks and bolts, is coming to America thanks to pressure from the Koch donor network and the allied elected officials it has harnessed to its purposes in ways we can talk about perhaps in the discussion, but in the 30 states they now control, as this radical rich donor network that Koch has built up tries to achieve the kind of Buchanan binding restraints that Buchanan urged. They now have 28 of the 34 states needed to call the first ever state-convened constitutional convention under Article 5 of our Constitution, while we've all been distracted by the president's tweets. 3 million, over 3 million people have signed the call for this on the right. It's not widely advertised for reasons you might imagine, but it is moving along. So, here, let me shift gears and say I have to perversely give the North Carolina General Assembly credit for helping me to understand this stealth project of the radical right and how it was affecting our world. I moved to North Carolina in the fall of 2010. I was still then working on the story of Freedmen in the schools, but Buchanan kept appearing in my peripheral vision. And as soon as we'd unpacked the boxes, it seemed, we had that midterm election where there was what people called the enthusiasm gap. And very few Democratic voters turned out to vote. And our Pope invested mightily, as did the Kochs, and we had the sweeping victories for a Republican Party more than ever seen since Reconstruction, and it was a radically transformed party since that Reconstruction Party, almost the exact opposite. And as this radicalized Republican Party, led by Tea Party allied officials, set to work, suddenly the things I was reading about in Buchanan's scholarly work and his other publications that still seemed so abstract started to become concrete, immediate, and frightening. I realized that these were his ideas in practice unfolding before my eyes. So let me frame this by saying that Buchanan by then had been arguing for a few decades that if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, as this radical right did not, he said, stop thinking about who rules and start thinking about the rules. And instead of focusing on which personality, therefore, you're going to put in office, start thinking about how you can change the rules under which they operate. In particular, he said you had to focus laser-like on the rules of governance. You had to, for example, break up the collective power to interfere with economic liberty, and you had to alter what was allowed and what was not allowed, and so forth. The GOP majority that set to work in 2011 carried out this vision to a T. Here, and there were also, Scott Walker was doing it in Wisconsin, others elsewhere, but we were one of the prime laboratories, as they boasted. So what were these radical changes? As you know, they go on to 5 or 6 single-space pages. I couldn't possibly go through them all, but let me pull out some of the most salient ones that give you a sense of all this. First of all, in that Project Roadmap, the most extreme and sophisticated gerrymander we have ever seen in American political history to make it so a minority party could choose its vote together in labor unions for collective voice, particularly public sector unions, and particularly teachers' unions, which are the largest left in today's America and the most significant lobbying force for liberal goods more generally. Attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it while pushing off tax dollars to private charter schools. Refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act despite a crying need for it in our low-wage state where so many people cannot afford health insurance. Rolling back measures to protect the environment and reduce global warming. And then when they got the governorship as well, what Democracy North Carolina rightly called the monster voter suppression bill, that in some 15 different ways kept people who could be predicted to oppose this agenda, tried to keep them from participating. What proved so disturbing to me as I watched this while reading Buchanan's work is that I could see that this new Republican majority was applying his analysis of the political process. Their top officials and strategists had weaponized his ideas about how government grew to reverse engineer the process, to take us back in their dream vision to the kind of society that prevailed not just before the Civil Rights era, not just before the New Deal, but even before the Progressive era, right? With graduated income taxes and consumer protections and direct election of senators and all the rest. They want to take us back to a time when property rights trumped all other public purposes. More than that, I saw how critics of all of this, whose concerns I shared, all the great people who had worked so hard to make North Carolina a beacon to the wider South, were so shell-shocked that they were missing the deep operational strategy that unified these far-flung measures. And also, it was hard for people to realize that those who were implementing this agenda were not misinformed about the likely consequences. They understood what the consequences would be, but they were coldly calculating that their end game would be worth the price. You could say, yet again, they were letting the chips fall where they may. My research found that the radical right in North Carolina and beyond were operating according to an ethical system that has gone unrecognized on the progressive side as such. I understand why that's difficult, because this ethical system is at odds with the best of every major religious tradition in the world. But it is an ethical system, and it has its own stark coherence that we need to understand if we are to be able to grapple with the crisis that the combination of Buchanan's ideas and Koch's money have brought us to. So to make this very plain, the libertarian morality says that it would be better to have people die from lack of health care than to receive that care from government, from taxes paid for by others. And at the end of the day, this is what they mean by personal responsibility. It's a very stark vision, not how you or I would define it, I don't think. They mean that you should be on your own for all of your needs in the world they want to bring into being. For your children's education, because there'll be no public schools, there'll only be private schools, for your health care, for your retirement, for your possible unemployment, all of these things. And if you fail to save for all of those future needs, you deserve your fate. More than that, some even suggest, witnessing your fate, your suffering, will teach others that they need to save, that they need to become more responsible. So how do I know this? In January of 2013, James Buchanan died at the age of 93. And finally, that September, I was able to get access to his private archive at George Mason University, what's called Buchanan House Archives. And in his records, going back to the 1950s, I found my developing understanding of all of this confirmed. And in a way that I have to tell you sometimes left me having to remind myself to breathe. I'll give you just one example. In his private office on the second floor, I found stacked on a chair a pile of documents that exposed how Charles Koch and George Mason Economics Department faculty and the president and the provost and the dean of the law school in this public university and a highly politicized board of visitors that included Ed Meese, if you remember that name, and many others from the right, how they'd cooperated to establish an intellectual base camp for this political project at a public university just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., at George Mason, which is now the main, Charles Koch is the main donor to this university. Whole sections of it have been weaponized in this project, etc. We can talk more about that. Once I brought home the documents that I'd copied at Buchanan House and put them together with the other sources I've been reading, I found myself laying down pieces of a puzzle that I have to tell you sometimes left me just nauseated in its scope and audacity. This project now encompasses dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, organizations like the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, lately so much in the news with the Kavanaugh nomination. It includes state organizations such as Civitas and the other Pope efforts here in North Carolina, almost 200 of those scattered around the country that are working together, and also organizing enterprises like Americans for Prosperity, Concerned Veterans of America, the Libre Initiative. There's another one that's supposed to be a counter to the AARP, whose name I'm missing now. In short, hundreds of organizations working very well funded to push this radical right agenda. So, tracing this operation that Charles Koch built up at George Mason and beyond to apply Buchanan's understanding of political economy to radically transform our institutions in a kind of quiet revolution. At this point, I'm almost ready to say a quiet coup, which I would not have said a year ago, but it's getting to that point. I realized the arc of my story, and that was that Koch had the money, but the money had proven ineffective until he turned Buchanan's Virginia School of Political Economy into an operational strategy to, in Buchanan's favored phrase, enchain the Leviathan. What he intended, though, he made clear in other settings, was to enchain the demos, the people, democracy. Not to get rid of, say, our Congress and our Supreme Court building and all these other functions, but to so change the rules with new laws and practices that they would not operate the way they've operated for more than 100 years. The idea, again, is to break down the power of organized citizens, to overwhelm the people's power with corporate money, to undermine regulation, to curtail transparency, and ultimately, to make changes to both state and federal constitutions that will lock in what this cause has never been able to get through persuasion or the electoral process. So why this way? Why stealth? That is my most important finding, I believe. I found them saying again and again in their own words, they understand they're a permanent, small, ideological minority. The people don't want to live in the kind of world they would create. People would stop it if they understood where this is going. That's why they're using stealth. I'm not going to go into the details here, although I can in the discussion because I want to leave more time for that. But I will say that the first time they embraced stealth was Social Security, right after Buchanan came home from Chile, fresh from the enthusiasm of that Constitution of Liberty. And the idea was basically that here was a popular program, extremely effective, had support among all sectors of the population, as Buchanan put it, black, brown, and white, men and women, Rust Belt and Sun Belt, I forget, and a few more things just to identify all bases. They knew people liked Social Security. So instead of accepting that and saying, hey, that's a great program, we should leave it as it is, no, he said, therefore we shouldn't, basically it would be a fool's errand to attack it directly. And he laid out a multi-step program for how to undermine popular confidence in it and how to break up the failings that supported Social Security. It's in chapter 11 of the book. Since then, since the 1980s, the Koch network and allied GOP elected officials have, that they've bent to their purposes with a threat of primary challenges and with dark money cash, have embraced stealth strategy with a vengeance. I'll just mention a few examples. Social Security and Medicare continues, a real desire to privatize those, which the right has always hated, but instead they talk about it as reform and don't say what they really mean, and our journalists don't know to ask them. Climate science denial. The Koch network is one of the leading purveyors of climate science denial in the world. The myth of voter fraud, the systematic promotion of an absolute myth and a slur, basically, to say there's mass voter fraud in America. Why? so that they can get measures that would restrict the vote, that would keep people from the polls who might oppose this. And sadly, what we're seeing in today's closing strategy of the GOP for the midterms, fear-mongering about immigrants because their core politics have so little support. Nobody believes in their tax bill, even their own voters. So what are they doing? Spurring, again, strategically leveraging this racial reaction as in 1959. It's come to this. So that's a lot, I know. But what does it mean for us, for people who are concerned about where our society is heading, as you showed me at the beginning that you are? Let me make this plain. I believe that what's at stake here is the future of democracy as we know it. What will be determined over the next few years in this country is whether we will be able to keep the kind of government that citizen action has demanded at least since the 1890s, since the populist movement of that era. A government that can stop corporate abuses, that can provide old age security and protect public health, that can fight discrimination, that can ensure our air and water quality and the fate of our planet. All of this and more is at risk right now. The challenge is a big one. There's no gainsaying that. But so, frankly, is the opportunity that this crisis presents. It's not like our system was functioning perfectly before this threat developed from the Koch right and accelerated over the last decade. On the contrary, I think most people in this room understand that we had some chronic problems that this acute threat, that enabled this acute threat to reach the point that it has. The problems of money in politics, the problems of misrepresentation through geographically based systems, the fact that we have fewer, I don't know why people aren't broadcasting this. I quoted in the book, but of 172 democracies in the world, we are, this was a few years ago, it's probably worse now, 138th. 138th in our participation, right, as the first modern republic. I mean, we should be ashamed of that, right? So there's all these problems out there, and I believe when I speak of opportunity, what I'm getting at is I believe that to subdue this acute threat, this very serious threat coming from the Koch network, we have to finally face up to those chronic problems. But here's some encouraging news, that people are really getting this now. Not everyone, but I think growing numbers, so much so that I am hopeful that we can prevail if lots more join the people who are already in motion. For more than a year now since this book came out, I have been on the road almost every week talking to audiences across America about the book and about the situation we're in right now. And in those travels, I have been really moved and truly inspired by all the people I've met and by the spreading awareness among them that we are at a pivotal moment in our country's history, at a kind of all-hands-on-deck emergency. This awareness, like nothing I have ever seen before, and I teach the history of social movements, this awareness crosses sectors, from community organizers to union members to environmentalists, from feminists to civil rights activists, from good government groups to senior citizens who worked hard to build a fairer, better world and don't want to see it ruined for their grandchildren. I imagine we have some of you here. The shared sense of urgency that is out there comes with a recognition that we cannot just keep doing the same thing in the same way and expect different results. We have to get out of our silos. We have to work together as never before. We have to change the public conversation about government, and we have to reform democracy to save it. That understanding is growing even among folks who paid little attention before to civic life. Think, for example, of the high school students from Parkland, Florida, who are now traveling all around the country, working with other students who are victims of violence to lift up their stories. Think of the teachers in the Red for Ed movement that started in West Virginia, spread across the country to Arizona and Oklahoma, came back to North Carolina and elsewhere. Think about the mothers and grandmothers of the self-proclaimed resistance that came together after the huge Women's March. Across the country, more and more people are becoming active because they see the stakes for what they are, the future of all of us. We are, after all, and I want to end here and underscore this, the vast majority. On issue after issue, the public agrees with the progressive side. And the rights architects, at the end of the day, are a relatively few. That is why they have to stoke the worst demons of our history to prevail. Imagine, then, what we could achieve if more of us recognized this simple truth. As an old poet once put it, we are many, they are few. And we came together to unchain democracy, to free a government, to make it truly, finally, of, by, and for the people, so that it can work for us to face the challenges of our 21st century world. That, I think, is the challenge and the opportunity we have now, and I look forward to talking more with you about it. Thank you for coming.
Wow. Courteous and concise, and there's a whole lot here to think about and a whole lot to read about. And I